Okay.
Good morning. Welcome to the 2020 Alan M. Boyden Memorial Lectureship. I'm Nick Cochler, Regional Director and Endowed Chair in Applied Healthcare Ethics at the Center for Healthcare Ethics here at Providence, where this year we're excited to be celebrating 20 years of service in healthcare. A few announcements before we get started. If you haven't done so already, please silence your cell phones or pagers. Medical grand rounds will go until 9 a.m., including some time for Q&A, and then we will pause to allow those who need to leave before we extend the Q&A session thereafter to 9:30. This presentation is being recorded. For those of you who don't know Dr. Boyden, he was a well-respected and world-renowned leader in local and national arenas who was a surgeon at Providence St. Vincent Medical Center for over 48 years. One of his greatest attributes as a physician and surgeon was his ability to find wholeness in the doctor-patient relationship. This lectureship promotes excellence in patient care by connecting medicine with the humanities. It is made possible by the generous contributions of our supporters through the Providence St. Vincent Medical Foundation. More information on this lectureship can be found in your handout. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Torree McGowan. Dr. McGowan is a board-certified emergency physician and fellow of the American College of Emergency Physicians. She served in the United States Air Force as an emergency physician and medical director for soldiers in combat, having deployed into Iraq and Afghanistan. An active U.S. Air Force reservist, Dr. McGowan is a nationally recognized speaker and expert on mass casualty response and is a practicing emergency physician with St. Charles Medical Group in Bend, Oregon. Dr. McGowan's interests include physician wellness, disaster medicine, trauma, and critical care. Her work around narrative medicine has been featured in the New England Journal of Medicine. Please join me in welcoming Dr. McGowan.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Is everyone able to hear? Yesterday I was too quiet, apparently. Okay. I will never forget Raul. He came into my trauma bay in Afghanistan in the middle of a mass casualty event, and he had what here in the United States would be a once-in-a-lifetime type of an injury for an emergency physician to see. IED blast, gunfight, hand amputation. But there, in the middle of a mass casualty, his injury was just a footnote. No immediate life threats, and he waited patiently as the rest of his comrades filed through the trauma bay with their open book pelvis fractures and off to the operating room with their blast lungs. And finally, it was his turn. He came into the trauma bay, and I walked up and introduced myself like I do to all of my patients, and I said, "Hey, I'm Doc McGowan. You're in the hospital in Bagram. You're safe. What's your name?" And he looked up at me and he said, "Raul, Doc, is my hand gone?" And I looked down at his right forearm that ended about mid-shaft in a bandage, and I said, "Yeah, it is. I'm sorry." And his big brown eyes filled up with tears. And he said, "How am I going to hold my daughter's hand? She's only 2. She won't understand." I rolled through the rest of my trauma assessment, and we talked about the incredible resiliency of toddlers and the advances in prosthetics. Right before he left the trauma bay, I grabbed onto his left hand, and I squeezed it, and I said, you tell her to hold on to this one. You saved it special for her." I often wonder now, his daughter would be about 9, a little bit older than my youngest. And I wonder what she grew to think of that prosthetic hand. And I wonder if she still holds his hand. Storytelling comes in many different forms. Written word, petroglyphs, cliff paintings, art, music, dance, Instagram, Twitter, all different ways to create a connection and to ensure that our experience on this earth does not end with us. If you ask my brother, he can tell you how to write a good story. He's an English teacher, a high school English teacher, and he's an expert at teaching people how to actually take those experiences and share them with others. He'll talk to you about the essential parts of a story, about the plot and the characters and the setting. He'll tell you to write a strong opening and to build the excitement and to create a conflict for your characters. He might show you something that looks like this. This is Freytag's pyramid. Freytag is an 18th century German playwright who created this model for writing dramatic stories. You set the setting and the characters in the exposition and introduce the story. You build that excitement through the rising action. You create a conflict for your characters that comes to the point of maximal intensity at the climax. It is then resolved through the falling action, and the story is closed and ended in the denouement. But the problem with medical storytelling is our lives, our stories, and our patients' stories run parallel for so many years. And then they just intersect for a few minutes or hours. We often jump in somewhere in the middle of the rising action, and we have to listen for what the exposition was to learn that beginning of the story. And then, especially in emergency medicine, we send patients on to their next area of care well before the resolution of what happens. That often leaves me searching for the ending, especially in the ER. I don't find out what happens to most of my patients. And in my brain, those jumbled pieces of the plot beg to be sorted out. How can we celebrate our patients' victories, or mourn with them their losses, or even just tell them what we hope for them if we never get that ending? One of the byproducts of technology in medicine is it has pushed us further and further away from our patients. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was a kid playing with my Fisher-Price stethoscope, there was no plastic laptop that came with it to make sure that we documented our interventions on our teddy bears appropriately. Not very many of us went into medicine for the thrilling charting that we got to do at the end of every day. Computers have pushed us further and further away from our patients. There was a study that was published in the American Journal of Emergency Medicine that looked at an average 10-hour shift for an emergency physician. You will click your mouse 4,000 times on an average shift. Over 2/3 of our time in medicine is now spent on charting and paperwork. Less than 1/3 of that is in direct patient care, the actual stuff that we wanted to do when we went into medicine. It's been really easy to ignore the cost of this technology takeover. It was kind of forced on us. We didn't have much of a choice. It was mandated by the government that we were going to embrace these wonderful electronic medical records. And don't get me wrong, there's been some wonderful things about them. It's really nice to be able to read the chart. It's nice to be able to find it. But, as with everything, there is an unintended consequence for any type of advancement, and we haven't talked about that at all. I often wonder what our role is in trying to claw that patient-physician relationship back out of those electrons and back into our exam rooms. How do we do that and really honor what patients value with us? Those continued pressures of corporate medicine make us have to fill out click boxes to be able to support all the things that we do in ways that do nothing to improve our patient care. Patients are voting loud and clear with their actions that the thing that they want most from us is our time and our care, not our paperwork. And they are increasingly turning to pseudoscience and unproven therapies because when you ask them, why did you go there? They say, they sat down with me and they talked to me. So how do we start to put a face behind that nameless white coat that so many patients are seeing now? Could maybe learning to listen to their stories better and tell some of our own start to bring us back a little bit closer? Medical storytelling has a beginning just like every story. And for me, my very first story that I got to tell in medicine was the first history and physical that I got to dictate. I'm an OHSU grad, and I was out on my rural rotation in Burns, Oregon, and I saw one of my very first emergency medicine patients ever. I still remember him. And my attending encouraged me to dictate the chart. And this was back when you actually did it into a phone and somebody listened and typed. In my mind, what my chart sounded like was something along the lines of 4-year-old male comes to the emergency department along with mom. Mom relates that the child has had a runny nose throughout the day and then began having a harsh, barky cough throughout the evening. She's noted some difficulty breathing. He's been afebrile, no known sick contacts, and he's been able to eat and drink well. Now, my transcriptionist had a bit of a sense of humor, and so she gave me the edited version, which sounds a lot like what I just said, and then the unedited version. I kind of love that she did that for me, and I love to see how far we've come. Because the ability to listen to somebody else's story and then translate it into something that we all recognize as croup is a skill that we develop in medicine. But it's being lost a little bit because now the skill is listen to someone tell a story and then translate it into click boxes in our EMR. And so you have to find intensity, duration, provoking, palliating, and make sure that someone who is non-medical can go in there and count up our click boxes to make our 99215. Our computers are really helpful with this to make sure that we have templates so we don't forget to go do a completely non-relevant review of systems. But it does nothing to actually help us take care of a patient and to build that relationship. This is one of the ethical challenges that we all face in this room, that is, how do we do enough things to be able to pay for the medicine that we do, to keep the doors open? We've got to be able to bill, right? But how do we prevent medicine from being so robotic, so computerized, that we lose that patient-physician relationship? And what I'd like to propose is that maybe a little bit of narrative medicine or storytelling is how we can do some of that work. The time pressures in the emergency department make it very difficult to wait for those stories. So we are very much judged on our throughput. I'm not the person telling the story. And so I have to wait for them to actually get to the point of the story where it is. And so anytime someone comes into the emergency room and they start out their story with 10 years ago, I want to say, anything that started 10 years ago has obviously not killed you yet. So why are you in the emergency room today? But it's not my story, and I have to wait for them to tell that and wait for them to set that exposition. One of my favorite patients that I will never forget was a chart that I picked up when I was still stationed in California, chief complaint of shoulder pain. And I went into the room, and there was an elderly African-American gentleman sitting there, didn't seem to be very uncomfortable. And I said, "What brings you to the emergency room today?" And he said, "Well, I fell at Pearl Harbor, and my shoulder's been hurting since then." I said, "Have you been on vacation to Hawaii recently, or are we talking about when the Japanese bombed?" And he said, "No, it's been a while." And he told me this story of being a cook on a destroyer that was anchored in Honolulu. And when the Japanese started their attack, many of his comrades were killed. He went up and he began loading ammunition. And he talked about a bomb going off near him and falling to the deck while he was carrying some of the munitions and injuring that shoulder. He had carried that injury with him for 75 years. And he'd never mentioned it to another doctor. And I asked him, "Why today? Why was this something that you wanted to come in for today?" And he said, "Well, I was down at the VFW, and they said I should probably get it looked at." And I said, "Great." I diagnosed his arthritis in that shoulder, and we talked about setting up some follow-up with the VA. And then I got to sit down and listen to the most incredible story that this man told me about being in something that I'd only read about. These are the types of stories that keep me coming back for another shift. These are the wheat among the chaff, that if we are able to have the time to listen to those are parts of the things that make our career full and valuable. One of the ways that we start to understand why communication and storytelling is so important in our communities is through research, through sociology. This particular study was published in Nature Communications, and it looked at the Agta tribe in the Philippines. This is a tribe of hunter-gatherers. And what they did is they went into a village and they asked, who is a good storyteller in your village? And they were allowed to name as many people who could tell a good story as they wanted to. And at the end, they were given rice and to say thank you for participating in our study. And then they looked at how did they distribute the rice amongst their village. What they saw was in villages that had more people that they identified as good storytellers, more rice was shared with the entire village. The good storytellers benefited even more. They got even more rice, but the entire village benefited. And the way that these researchers explained this was that storytelling helped create strong social bonds and connect that community together more. They asked another question in this study, which was, who would you like to live with in your village? And they could name anyone that they wanted. A good storyteller was more likely to be chosen as someone they wanted to live with than someone they were related to. A good hunter or gatherer, someone with medical knowledge. Being able to tell a good story was more important than someone who could feed you or save your life. Good storytellers were also statistically more likely to have living children in these societies. 0.5 more living children per good storyteller than someone who was not related as a good storyteller. The researchers suggested that this may be because of increased cooperation, that they received more social support, more resources in scarce times. My thought is maybe they're just better at talking people into bed. Neuroscience helps us understand why stories are so important to us as well. When you watch a PowerPoint and we put words up on the screen, you read those words or you listen to me talk to them, and Broca's area and Wernicke's areas light up. But that's it. It's the only thing that happens. And oh, by the way, if you have a lot of words on a slide, you actually can't listen and read at the same time. So everybody who was reading those words wasn't listening to what I said. We can't do that. But if we listen to a story, so much more starts to happen in our brains. If I describe to you how you can tell a serious head wound by the slightly salty smell of that CSF, your olfactory bulb just lit up. When I told you about Raoul and about holding his hand, your sensory cortex responded. And when I talked about squeezing it, your motor cortex fired as well. Stories make our entire brains work. This is through what are called mirror neurons, and they help us experience other people's stories, just like they were happening to us. Neuroscientists actually suggest that this is the biologic basis of empathy. This is how we experience other people's stories. So if storytelling is so important, and we get to experience other people's experiences through their stories, what happens when we don't know the ending of that? When we take a history of present illness, we hear some of the most profound stories of trauma, fear, illness, suffering, and our brains can't help but respond to that. We experience that along with our patients. But what happens if we don't know the ending of that story? What does that do to our brains to not be able to have that answer? The very first time I started to think about how important it was to have missing pieces of your story was when I was in Iraq. There was a group of people that would come through called Operation Proper Exit. This was a cooperation between the USO and the Wounded Warrior Project. And they would bring soldiers who had been wounded several years before and bring them back to the country and to the place where they'd been wounded. And they would take them back through the evacuation chain. They'd show them, this is exactly where it had happened to you. These are the people who came to get you with the rotary wing helicopters. These are the hospitals where you were cared for. These were the critical care teams who took you home. Because for most of these gentlemen, the last thing, and everyone that I saw come through was a male, although women were available, or it was open to women as well. every one of them, the last thing they remembered was getting hit. And then they woke up 3 weeks later in Walter Reed or Brooke Army Medical Center. They missed some of the most important pieces of their life. Some of the most transformational moments of anything that would happen to them was just completely gone. And so they brought them back to be able to experience that and see those pieces that they had lost. And every time they would come through Balad, where I was stationed, they would end up sitting around in our trauma bay and telling stories. And they would tell stories about what they remembered and their experiences. I remember there was 2 gentlemen who came through who were in the same unit and were injured by the same IED blast. So the dismounted IED, so when you're walking and a bomb goes off in front of you, it causes a very classic pattern of injury. It tends to be bilateral lower extremity amputations and severe groin wounds because of the blast wave that comes up. Soldiers know this. This is a very well-known pattern of injury. And so these 2 gentlemen who were hit at the same time talked about the IED going off and crawling towards each other, and then they made the other guy look to see if their testicles were still intact. Because they were too scared to look, but they needed to know. Almost every patient had at least 1 amputation. There was one man who had 90% burns. They talked about recovery and rehab. They talked about children being born and going back to work and coming back to active duty and continuing to serve. They talked about competing in Special Olympics and Wounded Warrior Games. And they said something that was so important to me. I watched them rediscover this missing piece of their life and fill in so many blanks. And every single one of them said, "Thank you. You saved me for a good life." That was a question I didn't even know that I had until I heard them answer it for me. These weren't the men that I'd taken care of. They were several years earlier. But they were the same injuries and the same worries. And you wonder when you see someone who is so injured and you fight so hard to save them, are you glad that I did that? Or would you have wished that maybe I didn't try so hard and that maybe I'd just let you go, knowing what was coming for you? And every single one of them said it was worth it. That was one of the transformational moments, not just of that deployment, but of my entire career. In emergency medicine, that's what we do. We patch you up and we send you off to the next step in care so that someone else can do the fine-tuning and start that long recovery. If I do my job right, people are only with me for minutes or hours. We hear this mantra in emergency medicine all the time. Time is brain, time is muscle, time is our job. But those few minutes or hours are so outsized in people's lives, in their impact. It's the tip of that climax that we are involved in. It's the moment when we diagnose the STEMI, when we identify the spleen lac, or when we start the antibiotics for the sepsis. That's when things start to change and start towards that resolution. But we ship them off to the next part of their care before we know that answer. This was often the last time I would see a patient. So this was heading out of our trauma bay and into the CAT scanner so that a patient could be then swept up into the vast machinery of medicine at war. And I found out that there was so much I wanted to tell these patients, so many things I wanted to say to them, but I didn't get a chance to when they were so sick. These types of worries and unspoken things that we don't get to say to our patients, I think, is part of the very complicated syndrome of compassion fatigue. Burnout is a really big buzzword in medicine, and we all know the statistics. Emergency medicine, at 67% of us have symptoms consistent with burnout. We call it burnout in medicine or compassion fatigue, but I think it really fits under PTSD. PTSD was first described in the United States in the Civil War. We called it nostalgia that was characterized by wanting to go home and crying in the middle of the night. We treated the physical symptoms of palpitations, nausea, diaphoresis with digitalis and morphine. We called it soldier's heart. In World War I, we saw the evolution to shell shock. World War II became battle fatigue or combat fatigue. The first Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, published in 1952, described a gross stress reaction. It assumed that the symptoms would be gone in 6 months after a traumatic injury or a traumatic event. The second DSM had adjustment reaction to adult life, which only had three opportunities to develop symptoms: suicidal thoughts in relation to an unwanted pregnancy, fear related to military combat, and Ganser syndrome, which was characterized by incorrect answers to questions from prisoners facing a death sentence. 1980 was the first time that post-traumatic stress disorder made its appearance in the DSM. It required a life-threatening event to happen to yourself to be able to develop these symptoms and be diagnosed with PTSD. But so many soldiers were coming back from combat who had never been in a life-threatening situation. So they couldn't have PTSD, right? And how is it that so many doctors are developing symptoms consistent with PTSD when it's our patients that are dying? Obviously, there's something missing in that definition. Burnout is a constellation of symptoms of cynicism, exhaustion, and decreased productivity. That could be present in any waitress at the end of a long shift at the diner or construction worker as they get near the end of a house. But that definition really fails to capture what's happening to our doctors and our soldiers, and why they have depression and suicidality at rates that so outstrip the rest of society. Litz and his colleagues published this article in Clinical Psychology Review in 2009 that defines a different syndrome that I think maybe captures a little bit better what's happening to our caregivers. Moral injury in war is usually triggered by events that center around the killing of a combatant, or even worse, killing a civilian. It's walking away when your buddy was killed, but you don't get a scratch. In medicine, it's discharging a patient that you know is going to die because they can't afford the care that they need. It's submitting pre-authorization after pre-authorization to fight for a basic need for someone, to have it kicked back from the insurance company because you got one word on the form wrong. It's saving that life, but knowing that that life is going to be full of pain and worry and suffering. These are the moral injuries of medicine. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that we experience this with our patients as well. When we hear those stories, those mirror neurons make sure that we experience it too. We're not just passive recipients of our patients' tales. We participate, we experience it, and we grieve. And those patients come with us. The rates of symptoms of PTSD in medicine are astonishing. One study of emergency physicians pegged the rate at 17%. That's on par with soldiers returning from war. But we don't get to leave our battlefields behind. We get to come back again for another shift. As physicians, we're the ones who do the studies that look at this type of repeated traumatization. And we publish the symptoms and we publish the treatments, but we don't look very closely at our own workplaces for the environments that are making this happen. If we as physicians saw 70% of people exposed to a condition develop symptoms, we would say that's an environmental disease. And we demand that they started looking at work schedules and toxins in the air and every other thing that we could think of that was causing this disease. Only in medicine do we say, we just need a stronger canary for that coal mine. Maybe we just teach them to be a little more resilient, or maybe do some yoga. I think that this is going to be one of our challenges in the next 10 years, to try to figure out what it is about our environment that is causing caregivers to leave medicine at such a rapid rate. If we don't figure this out, When we are old, there is not going to be anyone to take care of us. Until then, though, we have to find ways to deal with it on our own, because there are some places that are starting to look at these initiatives and starting to look at that environment. But people are leaving medicine and killing themselves at a rate that we can't wait for someone else to fix it. And one of the ways that I found to deal with that is through writing. I can't always find the words to deal with my shadows. And I don't always have time for them in the middle of a resuscitation. And when I can't find the time to deal with that, I write the words that I'd rather say. I write to finish those stories and that unfinished business that patients leave me with, that I take home with me. I write the words that I can't say. About 8 years ago, I got a phone call from my cousin Jerry. In 33 years of my life, I'd never gotten a phone call from Jerry, so this was very unusual. I was still living in California. And he said, "My eyes and my skin have gotten yellow. Should I be worried?" And I prayed for yeses to my questions. I said, "Does it hurt? Have you been vomiting? Is there anything else going on?" And he said, "No, I feel fine otherwise." We all know the answer to this. The differential diagnosis of painless jaundice rarely ends in anything good. What I said to him was, "Yeah, you need to get that looked at. You need to be seen pretty soon." Because I couldn't say the words to my favorite cousin, the one who used to hang me upside down by my ankles in the middle of his kitchen. I couldn't tell him, "You're already dead. The rest is just details." And unfortunately, it was a few short months before the cancer proved my words true. He had a few short months to spend on his ranch with his young daughter. This is one of the last pictures that I have of him. But that lie of omission that I told him weighed very heavily on my heart. This is where I went to college. This is the Air Force Academy. Our honor code there is we will not lie, steal, or cheat, nor tolerate among us anyone who does. And one of my very deeply held beliefs is in the importance of honesty. This was my moral injury of those half-truths that we tell because we can't really say that brutal honesty. It's been a couple of weeks ago. I took care of this gentleman in my emergency room. He came in and he said, "About October, I started having pain in my back, and now it's kind of wrapping around in my belly, and I've lost about 40 pounds. The CT scan showed exactly what I expected it to. And I had to go back in and use that patient-physician relationship that I spent about 10 minutes creating, because this is the emergency room. We don't get much time to do that. And I had to take that and completely destroy his life. What words do I choose for that? How much do I harm him by telling him this is cancer before I have a biopsy and pathology so that I can tell him all the details? Balanced against what autonomy do I owe him to be able to start making decisions for what proves to be a very short rest of his life? There's a fine line between that kind half-truth and ruinous empathy. And what I chose for this gentleman was, we don't know for certain, but it looks really concerning for cancer. The oncologist that you'll see in 2 days will help us get more information. And he looked at me and he said, "Is this the kind of cancer that kills you right away?" The lie that I chose for him then was a lot more charcoal colored. I said, "We don't know for sure, but it looks pretty concerning." And so that is a struggle that I deal with in emergency medicine a lot. How do I balance the brutal honesty that is fueled by the cynicism of being an ER doc? Because I only see you when you are not doing well, and we only see the bad things. Teetering against that hope that maybe I'm wrong, maybe this isn't as horrible as it looks, and how much injury do I do that patient along that balance? And so because I don't know that right answer, I write my brutal honesty, but my mouths tell those shades of gray. Sebastian Junger is a journalist who has spent a lot of time embedded with various combat units in some of the worst places in the world. And he wrote this book that I really liked that talks about the importance of community support in reducing PTSD. And one of his points in the book is that up until Korea, war was a very community experience. Wars happened in your own backyard, and you got to see them. And if you were a Londoner in World War II, you spent months in a bomb shelter, even if you were a civilian, because war was happening all around you. It wasn't until Korea and our most recent conflicts that war happens over there. It happens in a remote corner of the world, and we get a soundbite every now and then, and less than 1% of our current Americans have served in the military, and so we don't understand what's happening. And so when those soldiers come back, there are silences they have to explain. I remember my very first deployment, or excuse me, this was on my second deployment, I lied. Miley Cyrus had that thing with the teddy bears. Do you remember this? It was such a big deal. It was all anybody could talk about. And I was in Afghanistan doing what are called ramp ceremonies. So this is a ramp ceremony. When a US soldier is killed, when they bring his body to load it onto the aircraft, the entire base turns out and we line the runway between the ambulance that brought him and the ramp of the aircraft. Not a word is said. Everyone stands at attention and salutes as the body passes. And then those people just fade away into the night. That never once showed up on the television news, but boy, they could talk about this stupid starlet. That same sense of living in an alternate reality happens in medicine as well. I remember I made a comment in casual conversation to a non-medical friend about a psych patient who had left her dirty underwear hanging on the door handle of the bathroom in the ER. And my friend was just horrified. She said, nobody would do that. And I just laughed and I said, oh yeah, that and more. But people don't understand that. They don't understand the world that we live in. And they often ask, but they don't really want to know. They'll say, what's the craziest thing you've seen, or what's the worst thing you've seen? And that story, aimed at my deployment, actually prompted me to write and publish my first piece, that was this one. I struggle with that question, both from my military and my civilian medical experience, because here's the thing. People don't actually want to know the worst thing we've seen. They want to hear something funny like a rectal foreign body. They don't want to hear about the 4-month-old that I had to send to a pediatric surgeon to have the plastic toy removed from his sigmoid that he'd been sodomized with. They don't want to hear about the heroin addict who was hooked by her pimp and is now a slave to the drug and can't get out. Those stories actually aren't as funny as what people think. But that's the ugly truth of our medical society, or of our medicine. And there's a lot of darkness in our jobs. And I want to shield my family and my community from that, the same way that I wanted to shield my family from what happened to me while I was deployed. But after reading this article, I started to change my mind about that a little bit. This is Junger, that same author that had the book up earlier. He has a very interesting point in this article. What he says is we all share the moral burden of war, the entire country. You might not have voted for the people in power, but we all pay taxes. This is all our government. And each one of us owns a tiny piece of that. And unless soldiers tell their stories, we can't share that moral burden. We don't know what's happening over there. That's true in medicine as well. Unless we tell our stories, nobody knows what happens behind those automatic doors. We have to start sharing, because the moral burden of this healthcare system that we are in, with all of its flaws and failings and miracles, our country owns that as well. And until we tell our stories, they don't understand what's happening. One of the most surprising parts of sharing has been the sense of community that I have found. Medicine feels very isolating as we hide behind patient confidentiality. The first thing that anyone is told if they have a bad outcome is don't tell anybody because they can be subpoenaed. But that puts that wound into suspended animation. You can't talk about it or share that burden with anyone else. Writer David Sedaris said, "I feel bad for people who don't write because when something bad happens to them, there's nothing they can do about it." When I started to write about my experiences, I worried about privacy, so I got very careful about de-identifying and mixing patients together so that not any one experience was too identifiable. But patients are often surprised at how common their suffering is, that it's not the only abused child that I've seen or grandmother whose hand that I held as they died. I was also surprised by how my suffering was not unique either. When I shared this article, it's been viewed on the internet over 250,000 times. And I heard from people all over the world telling me how those worries in my heart were the same ones that they carried home with them. They used it with medical students and residents to start developing a conversation about the things that we bring home and this idea that we are not separate from our patients' lives, but we actually participate. I write because I have to. I write in the middle of a sleepless night when the words won't let me sleep. And when they come out, it feels like a little less of a stranglehold on me. They're my words and my pain, and I'm often reluctant to share them. There's a lot of things that I've written that will probably never be shared. But as terrifying as it is to stand up here and talk about this and to share it, I found strength there. I found support and community and peace, and I found a tribe. There are many physicians who are writing incredible works. Many of your popular novelists are physicians. If you aren't quite ready to write your book yet, there are online resources to help you learn how to write if you've forgotten everything from your high school writing class. Stanford has a really wonderful online series that you can do. Harvard has a medical writing workshop that is an in-person three-day workshop that will teach you everything from how to start a blog to setting up a podcast to pitching your memoir. It's available for CME and is highly praised by physician writers. If you're not quite ready to even write a blog post for 1,000 words, check out the hashtag #ThoseWeCarry on Twitter. This is 160 characters, and as you can see, you can create an incredible connection with just these tiny, short pieces of literature. People are very interested in what we have to say because they want to know what is happening in our healthcare system and what that experience is. New England Journal of Medicine has their perspectives that is dedicated to the patient-physician relationship. Hectoin International is a medical humanities journal for music and art and all of the exploration of the patient relationship. There are blogs like Kevin MD and Doximity. There are so many places that are interested in publishing your stories and hearing what's happening. If you're not a writer, if you like spoken word, Airway events are short TED Talk style opportunities to share your stories. The Nocturnist is a podcast that has much that same. There are several storytelling events here in the Portland area that are looking at narrative medicine and sharing these stories. There are so many places and so many people eager to hear what we have to say, and so many people that are interested in helping you learn how to develop those skills. Online communities that will read and proofread and help you find outlets for your writing. I encourage you, if you've ever thought, just send something out there. Reach out to me. I'm happy to help you connect with resources. People want to hear what we have to say about medicine. Why do we work so hard as humans to create meaning? In 1944, there's a famous study by psychologists Fritz Heider and Marianne Simmel. They showed this movie, and they asked people to narrate what was happening in the story. It still works today. If you ask people, they usually come up with a story about hiding and escape and capture. But if you ask a computer to do this, it can't. Despite all of their fancy algorithms, they cannot come up with a reason or a story as to why these circles and triangles are in this box. It takes a human to do that. At its heart, this is how we keep humanism in medicine, how we keep humans in medicine. It is the story that connects the schistocytes and the murmur to tell the story of mechanical valve hemolysis. A computer could maybe put those together and come up with a differential, but it can't tell the story of what it took out of that patient's life. It can't tell you about the evening walks in the warm wind or the feel of your heart beating in your chest as you play with your kids. As humans, we crave meaning in something so simple as circles and triangles in black and white. And that meaning in that patient-physician relationship is so much more important. Compassion fatigue, burnout, PTSD, a rose by any other name still has sharp thorns. I write to end my piece of my patients' stories, to be able to tell them all the words and the hopes and the dreams that I have for them, to tell them I'm sorry. And that helps me tend the wounds that they leave in me, because that requires some care so that I can have enough to go on and go back for that next shift. It helps me have enough to pick up that next chart and go back and do this again. And the other thing that I found is by being able to share my love for my patients and that vulnerability, it has brought me much closer to them. Being able to share that pain and that sorrow and that hope puts a face behind that stethoscope, and it brings us much closer to our patients. And I'll just leave you with some more of those very short stories, and I'm happy to take any questions. Yep. Thank you so much.
So we have a few minutes for Q&A.
Any questions? Ma'am.
Well, I don't know how common this is, but I see a physician at the Oregon clinic and she brings in a scribe. She introduces me, she asks if it's okay if the scribe is in the room, and I have the physician's complete attention.
And that's a wonderful comment. I'm not sure if you all could hear. She was commenting that her physician that sees her, I believe it was the Oregon clinic, uses a scribe. And that is actually one of the ways that we are starting to honor the fact that people really don't come to see us so that they can stare at the back of our heads while we type things into a computer. But when we try to fit everything into a 15-minute appointment, that's kind of what we're left with. One of the ways that we are addressing that in medicine is the use of scribes. I know that I am always excited when I come to a shift if I have a scribe with me that day, because you're right, it does open up that ability to be able to interact and do the things that only I can do. There are some really innovative team-based approaches to primary care that actually bring in an entire team of people into the room when that happens. One of them is a scribe who does nothing but transcribe the history and physical. One of them is an MA that is putting in orders. So when I tell you, I'm going to order a chest x-ray on you, that's into the computer before you ever leave the room. There's a nurse there that's ready when I start to say, I'm going to start an IV. They're pulling that out. So that team-based approach can really start to help open us up to be able to, once again, do the things that are unique to us and that patients value, which is our time. Awkward silence.
Well, I have a question, if I may.
Yes.
One of the, you touched on it earlier in your talk. One of the comments that came up yesterday and that I think is important for us to balance that our commitments and storytelling is respecting patient privacy. So what are some of the tricks or the tools that you use, the ways of thinking about that helps protect patient privacy while also telling the story?
That's a great question, and honestly, it's one that I really struggle with and that I'm still learning every day. One thing that I try, one of the mechanisms that I use is I tend to write a lot in the first person as if I'm speaking to someone. And so instead of using gendered pronouns, I will say you. The piece that's in your handout, you will notice that the only identifying pieces of that are, it's a child in diapers. I do mention a diaper, but I never told you an age. I never told you if it was a boy or a girl. I have also practiced in 7 different states and 3 different countries. I never told you where I was or when that was that I cared for them. I told you it was a Sunday, I think. And so another mechanism that I will do is I will bring different patients together and create an amalgamation of patients. So I do take a little creative license there to take one piece of someone's story and bring it together with another piece of a different patient's story. If I am concerned that there is enough of one patient's experience that it's going to be identifiable in my very small town, I reach out to the family and say, is it okay if I share this? I don't identify you, but there is enough that someone could assume that this is. Most people are very excited to hear that. Some people have had negative experiences to that, and so then I tend to be very cautious with that. So it's not a perfect answer, but those are the ways that I've started to work through that. But great question. In the back.
What's that? Oh, it's on. Hi, thank you so much for sharing this. I had a question when you were talking about giving the person the diagnosis or not. Mm-hmm. And in palliative care, I know that they will ask for the person's permission, or, how much do you want to know about what's going on with you? Do you ever use anything like that, or do you have anything to say about that one?
That's a great question, and it's one thing that I often do, because of course in emergency medicine, we often intersect with palliative care, because this is often where we start that mechanism going forward. In my patients that are a little bit more advanced, I often say, tell me where you are in your disease, and just kind of get a little bit of a barometer of what do you think is currently happening. And I am often surprised at the people who say, when I look in their chart, it says stage 4 palliative, moving towards end of life, and they say, I'm gonna go on a cruise next year, I'm beating this. I'm like, okay, let's talk a little bit more about where we are with that disease. Giving the diagnosis is a lot harder because I certainly see a lot of patients in the ER that this is the first time that they have heard that there might be something wrong with them. The gentleman that I spoke about, he'd been doing some Googling, and he had actually, during my first history and physical with him, he said, when I said I'm gonna do a CAT scan, he said, will that see my pancreas? And I said, it will. That's one of the things that we worry about. And so the way that I actually brought it to him is I said, you asked me earlier if this could be something with your pancreas. And I'm really concerned that it is. In emergency medicine, it is so hard because as soon as you tell someone they have cancer, the next question is, am I gonna go on chemo? Do I need surgery? How long do I have? And we in this room know that diagnosis and that prognostic stuff requires so much more information than one CT scan. And so it's really hard to talk in generalities. And I usually don't tell patients, this is definitely cancer. What I will say is this looks really concerning, but we need further information. Another thing that I try very hard to do is before I went in and talked to this gentleman, I called my oncologist and I said, I need a date and a time that they need to see you. I need not leave the emergency room, call and arrange your own follow-up, good luck. Because to me, that is too much to ask of a patient who I've just given that information to. So this gentleman, I walked in and I said, here is your next step. You will see this doctor at this time. Here's the address, and we'll get you the next step of information. I don't know if I'm doing it right or not, but I am always eager to listen to my palliative care colleagues to have those conversations better, because I know that voice will play over and over in their heads. The first time that you're told you have cancer is one of those flashbulb moments. Yeah.
I'm not very very familiar with the whole veterans situation, but you were saying that one of the saddest things for you is knowing that the patients are not, one of the things is that the patients are not going to be able to afford the care that they need that will allow them a fruitful life. And how do you go with this, and how does the Veterans Administration go with this? Or what, maybe I'm asking the wrong question, but that's it.
Incredibly difficult question to answer, and the VA system is so incredibly complex. Most of my military soldiers, I actually had a little bit better hope that they would receive that follow-on care. The Veterans Administration, if you can make it through the incredibly complex wickets, has good care, but it's getting through those wickets of that. And I will often tell patients, even as a veteran myself and using that system, if I didn't have the medical knowledge that I have to be able to get through those things, that I wouldn't necessarily be as successful as I am. And I actually kind of have the backdoor ways of, I know this guy at the VA who's really good at getting people in, which is a terrible system because that shouldn't be the system. There are other methods that help patients that are transitioning from active duty and into the VA system. I think the bigger piece of that, though, is the importance of telling stories, because we see this in medicine and we understand. There is a very nice lady that I take care of at one of our hospitals. We staff 3, that I see about once a month because she can't afford her outpatient insulin. And so we bring her into the hospital and we tune her up and we send her out with as much as we can. And then 6 weeks later, she's back because she's out of insulin again and she's back in DKA and she's sick enough to be admitted, and we do it again. Most people don't understand that, though. And until we tell that story, until we share that, not just here in this room, but with people that can read that and start to say, I don't know what the right answer is for our healthcare system, but whatever it is, I don't think it looks like this. And telling those stories so that people understand what's happening to our patients, I think is really important, so that it stops being that thing that happens there and that thing that happens to us.
One of the trends in medicine that concerns me is the virtual disappearance of the office-based general internist. And that was evidenced in one of your slides where the burnout rate for internal medicine is just almost as high as emergency medicine. Do you have any ideas or thoughts about how we might reverse that trend?
I wish I could tell you the perfect answer, and I 100% agree with you. One of the first things that I tell patients, and I actually have a little dot phrase in Epic that says, you need a primary care doctor to help coordinate your care. This is the most important part of your care team. Here are our primary doctors that are accepting new patients. It's that important. One of the ways that is, and unfortunately, it's an incredibly undervalued part of medicine. We don't reimburse that care well. It's not as well reimbursed as sewing up a laceration or things like that. And so many people are disincentivized from going into primary care because of those imbalances. And it's hard work, and it's complicated work that takes more than what you have of a 15-minute appointment to do it right, especially for our more complicated patients. Some of the ways that I've seen those hospital or those clinic-based primary care doctors becoming more successful, and when I say success, being able to keep the doors open and finding a job that is satisfying and that they create a patient relationship that they appreciate and is sustainable. That, to me, is success. Is those team-based approaches where you bring the entire team in with you, so instead of you spending so much time on the computers and typing and putting in pre-authorizations, all of that happens when you're in the room. Everybody but you has a computer so that they can do all of the things while you do the non-computer things. Another move that has been happening a lot is this idea of direct primary care. So finally saying, we're done with insurance companies, you don't pay me well anyway, and so I'm going to contract directly with the patient just like we used to. And and taking that piece of it out to allow that to happen. A lot of that comes through, or a lot of the ability to sustain that model has to come through shifting those resources and those incentives. And I'm also, some of this is speaking just from discussions with colleagues because I'm not a clinic-based physician, so I can't speak to that particularly well. One of the reasons that I went into emergency medicine is I could never have done that incredible work. I don't have the patience for it. So those are some of the different ways that I see that happening. But it is one of the most important pieces of coordination to make sense of this incredibly specialized system we're in now.
So we are just at or before 9 o'clock, so those who need to go about your day, please feel free to do so. For those who wish to stay for additional Q&A, please move up closer and just give a few moments for folks to make their exits.
My nose has decided to run.
So I think we have a question in the middle.
Yeah, hi. First of all, thank you for your presentation and also for your military service.
Thank you.
I'm a chaplain resident, 6 months into the residency year. Much of my cohort is here today, along with staff chaplains.
Wonderful.
And what's striking to me is what you're talking about in eliciting these stories from people really rings true to me and is a big part of our focus in learning how to elicit these stories from patients. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the overlap between what you've presented on this morning and what chaplains and social workers do as well, maybe some of the commonalities and differences and how they can work better together.
Wonderful question, and I love it. And you actually touched on kind of something that I learned yesterday, or an idea that formed for me so I gave this talk yesterday at St. Vincent's and then had an opportunity to have brunch with some of one of the sisters over there and some of the chaplains and then some family members of Dr. Boyden. And it struck me during that conversation exactly what you're saying, which is in medicine now, everything is driven based off the doctor's time, the doctor's chart. And that's why it's so important that we click correctly and we generate bills and we do RVUs, because really, for the most part, most of the money is driven by the doctor's chart and how that's billed. And so because of that, we have to make our doctors as efficient as possible. So we make them see patients in 15 minutes and we get them through as quick as we can. And we have created this incredible system to support all of the things that doctors aren't able to do, like sitting down and spending time and listening to how does this illness affect your life? And what impact is that having? And how does that start to make sense? And until we are better at understanding that there is more in medicine than just that doctor's chart that matters, and reimburse that in a different way, we actually have to look to our teammates and say, this is something that is so important that we will bring in someone else to give you that time because the doctor isn't able to give you that time, which as a doctor embarrasses me and I think it's terrible. I've actually been able to find a practice location where I work in Central Oregon. We have a community hospital and 2 critical access hospitals. And some days it is a dead sprint from the beginning to the end. And some days I see a patient every couple of hours. It tends to be very variable there. I've worked in everything from level 1 trauma centers all the way down through tiny little places. And I chose a practice because it gives me the time to be able to do that, because I value that time so much more. And oh, by the way, I only have a social worker 1 day a week. And so it's this complex interdisciplinary team that when there's not enough social work, I take more of that work and do more of that type of stuff. And when the team has those other resources, a lot of times we look to you for that. I'm a storyteller, in case you guys didn't catch that part. When I was in San Antonio, we also had chaplain residents at Brooke Army Medical Center where I trained, and one of my favorite stories was one of my chaplains. So we recorded all of our traumas that came in. And we had this one guy that came in who was experimenting in alternative pharmaceuticals, came into the trauma bay, he'd wrecked his car, and he was just swinging at everybody, just absolutely uncontrollable. And when we were in the trauma bay, the chaplain and the chaplain resident would stand right behind the person up at the head of the bed who was doing the evaluation. So they were kind of right over here. And so this guy is completely wild and uncontrollable, and we said, okay, we need to intubate him to keep him safe and we can figure out what's going on. And so we get the IV in, and my nurse pushes the succinylcholine, which is the paralytic, right as my chaplain steps forward and puts a hand on him and starts to pray as he's going to sleep. And we go ahead and intubate him, and we get him off to the CAT scanner, and off we go. And then, interestingly, I happened to be on my ICU rotation that next week, and so as this guy woke up, somehow someone showed him the video of that resuscitation, and he saw what his interpretation was, I'm completely wild, I'm fighting like crazy, and the moment that the chaplain laid a hand on me, I became calm. And I don't know if it stayed. He said, I've changed my life. I know that the chaplains were in his room every day praying with him, and said that he had had a religious conversion. And I'm thinking in the back of my head, I'm pretty sure that was succinylcholine, but you do you. But it's still one of my favorite experiences because I am so hopeful that that did take, that he saw that as God's hand on him to bring him healing. Because, hey, I can fix all of the little things, but I can't fix the choices that got you to that trauma bay. So just a little story there. Sir. Oh, sorry, we had someone behind you. I'll catch you next.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your service, number one.
Thank you.
Not just on the battlefield, but in the ED. I've spent 30 years, and I know everything you're talking about. And at this point in time in my life, I'm still working, but I'm working in an IC. And in the period of time that I've worked, as we all have, we've seen, change, which is a constant in life. But I'm just wondering if you've given this speech actually to the administration. Because we are being moved more and more to, as it's always been, to see more with less in less time. And when you talk about burnout, I've made it to the end of my trip, and I'm happy with that. Mm-hmm. But, I watch the youngsters, and, they're just getting out of school, they're just starting their careers, and they're being told, you need to work harder, and you need to work with less in a shorter period of time, and with shorter staff now, too. Yep. I think that sometimes the administration is so far removed from the clinical arena that this speech or your lecture would go a long ways, perhaps, to helping them maybe realize that there is burnout and there will not be anyone left to take care of patients if we keep treating our staff this way.
Well, thank you for that lovely comment. This is actually only the second time that I've given it. This was written for the Boyden lecture series. I do a lot of speaking in emergency medicine. Usually it's clinical, so this actually feels really vulnerable to stand up here and talk about the worries that I have and the love that I carry for my patients. But you're exactly right. The continued message that we get from on high is do it faster, do it with less. I don't care if you're short-staffed, just keep going. And what do you mean? What do you mean you don't want to work more shifts than what you agreed to? Just come in. We hear this on a regular basis, especially in emergency medicine. You only work 12 days a month. How can you be burned out and tired?
But you work 16 hours a day, even if it's a 10-hour shift.
Exactly. You see 12 on my schedule, but let me tell you what the rest of that, and one of the ways that I share that is, let me tell you about what the blank space on my calendar looks like. One thing that I tell my medical students is, and I have the same worries that you do, that students are being told, watching for burnout, and this is how you make your exit from medicine just as you were getting in there. And here's the thing, I love medicine. I love what I get to do. I'm frustrated by a lot of it, and I certainly do get burned out, and I'll tell you what, at the end of 5 12s, I am a little more feisty than I am at the first 12. But I tell them to, number one, fight for our profession, and that's part of what this is, and you're exactly right. Patients want us in their room and spending time with them, and we have to figure out how to take care of the people that are taking care of others. Because if we don't do that, and there are other people that are doing way better work, and I know that I just kind of side glanced at compassion fatigue and burnout, because there are other people that are doing way better work than that. One of my colleagues is a lady named Wendy Dean, and she has an absolutely wonderful website and movement called Moral Injury. I think it's moralinjury.info, and is doing incredible work talking about exactly these ideas of, this isn't what I signed up for. This is not what I wanted to do when I went into medicine. I didn't want to do my charting. I didn't want to fill out forms. I wanted to take care of patients, and how do we get back to that? I don't know that that's a perfect answer for it, but I 100% agree, and I'm happy to tell stories to whoever's willing to listen. Sir, I think you were next, and then I'll grab you.
Oh, thank you. How do you think a single-payer system might influence or not any of these issues, particularly the doctors' dilemmas, not including what happens to the building clerks in the back office?
Incredibly difficult question. And the bottom line is if this was an easy answer, it would have been fixed a long time ago. There are definitely pieces of single-payer healthcare that I like. This idea of, yes, you can get the follow-up, much less complexity in our systems of how we bill, and much less of that overhead that happens. I have concerns about just looking at other places that have single health payer systems. Honestly, a lot of those countries end up with kind of a 2-tier system, which is single payer for most folks, and then those who can afford it have a second tier. I don't know what that right answer looks like. I like the ideas of everybody can get care that they need to, decreasing the complexity of what happens in our billing and our administration, because I'm sure you all have seen that graph, the number of doctors going like this and the number of administrators going like this. And again, those administrators, they don't create any revenue. They don't create any value to the patient care experience. They just create more complexity. And there's probably an administrator. There's an administrator in the room, and I'm now in trouble, sorry. And I'll tell them that. Yeah, I love you all, but you're not generating that. But yes, but them hearing that is sometimes different.
So where does that start? Does that start with us complaining? Does that start as us forming groups and saying it's got to change? Because in my experience, that has never worked.
I don't know that I have that right answer. I think a lot of it comes from, or I think how we start this work is, again, telling those stories that many people, so I tend to be a data person. If you want to argue with me, bring me numbers. That's what I'm really driven by. And a lot of people are very data driven, that they want to see, and especially in medicine, we're scientists, right? That's how we got here. I want to see the study and the number needed to treat and the positive predictive value of what's going to happen here. But many of our people that are doing the administration are more business people. And many of them tend to be much more motivated by outcomes and by stories. And so some of that, learning how to almost be a translator between, let's talk about what 67% compassion fatigue looks like, and what is that one physician who we finally drove to the edge? What is that story of the doc in your organization that finally said, I can't do this anymore, and killed themselves? How do we put a face and a person to the number so that people who think differently or are motivated differently from us can feel and understand that argument? I don't know if that's how the work starts.
So I think I'd like to push us a little bit. This is an important conversation, to be sure. I do want to suggest, I mean, the financial pressures seem to be real. And particularly one element that maybe I haven't heard you speak to as much, Dr. McGowan, in some of the emergency medicine and some of your military experience, is the sort of rural practice environment that we don't know as much here in the I-5 corridor that you might on the 97 corridor. But rural hospitals all over this country are closing.
Yep.
They're closing, whether they're a one-hospital shop, whether they're a part of a not-for-profit system, or if they've been bought up by a for-profit system. They're closing all over this country. And I wonder if you have thought about that at all, and if you have a perspective on sort of what this question about the big ails that affect the U.S. healthcare system look like in more rural parts of our country, and what might be lost with this sort of dried out.
And if I may just take a bit of a spin on that question, because I want to kind of frame it back around storytelling. So what might be the impact in rural healthcare on the interruptions or the disruptions in a caregiver's story or a patient's or family's story that makes it easier to tell or harder to tell?
I'm pretty sure my administration gets kind of tired from hearing from me, because I've not exactly been known for pulling my punches. And one thing that St. Charles administration has heard several times from me related to this idea of healthcare being very rural. So Bend tends to be our mothership over there. This is our biggest healthcare, our biggest hospital. And then the other smaller hospitals are, oh, by the way, there's a couple of them out there. They're kind of maybe sort of like clinics, and then maybe we admit a patient every now and then. But all of our specialty care is in Bend. And I've probably been on the phone with one of you in this room, sending you a patient over, because when we're full over there, we have something that they don't, if my one guy who does endoscopic ERCPs is out of town, I'm looking for someone else. So we transfer patients a lot through our system, and we are really good at getting people to Bend. We are terrible about getting them back to where they started. And Madras especially is very heavily influenced by my Warm Springs population, and many of you may know that Warm Springs is the poorest community in Oregon. I think I saw a statistic that was the average income of people in Warm Springs was $12,000 a year. Highest poverty rate, incredibly crushing poverty that these patients deal with. And when I take a patient who is so affected by poverty and I have to send them to Bend because I don't have a surgeon, because we as a hospital system have made the decision we are not going to staff a surgeon at these outlying hospitals, and I send them to Bend, I have had 2 patients in the last 4 years that have been brought back to me in the Madras emergency room because we transferred them to Bend, and we discharged them in Bend, and we didn't provide them with a ride back home. And they were hitchhiking from Bend up 97, and some nice soul stopped and picked them up with their, their patient belongings in their little patient belonging bag, ID band still on, and said, wow, you just got out of the hospital and you look terrible, and now you walked 5 miles. I'm just gonna take you right back to the emergency room. What a terrible way to take care of a human. We need to ask those questions about, if I make you go an hour away from your home, which, oh, by the way, let me say, from your home hospital, which might be an hour and a half away from where you actually live, can I get you back? And maybe I don't have to get you all the way home, but don't I at least deserve to get you back to that hospital where I took you from? Because my system and my hospital made the decision that we are no longer going to have a general surgeon here and they're going to be somewhere else. Those are the types of questions why my administrators don't like hearing from me. Because, and it's really easy to frame that in a really patient-centered way and say, do you really think this is the right, do you really want them wearing a big thing that says St. Charles across the front of it as they're hitchhiking down the road? There is nothing good about any of that. So that question of rural healthcare, and the other thing is, and again, why I tell these stories, if you live here in Portland, you say, well, just get on the Max. You know, they can take public transportation home. There is no public transportation. We have to tell stories to show how our experiences are different because we are so vast and complex that unless we tell stories about like people hitchhiking home from the hospital, I bet none of you had that idea in your head that that might actually be a thing that you'd have to do. Yeah.
Do you have a little story about how? Do you have a story about how you're using stories to really kind of turn on the heart of an administrator made a difference?
I'm still working on the hitchhiking one. They haven't gotten there yet, but it's one that I keep banging the drum of. And so that's one of my best of saying, you know, pointing to a very tangible thing. And that conversation, I think that I've almost gotten them to agree to either pay for a cab back to or buy a minivan and a shuttle and have that as the shuttle. I mean, to me, it seems like fairly easy answers. Yeah, what a great idea. These conversations of, well, actually an excellent example is in Madras and Prineville, our Medicaid ED utilization rates are off the chart. So many of you will know that that's a QIMS measure, that your ED utilization, if you have over a certain amount, you don't get your kickback from Medicaid. And it's kind of funny because as soon as an administrator comes to me and says, how are you going to fix ED utilization? I kind of giggle. And I say, well, you obviously don't understand this metric because even though it says ED in the title of it, I can do absolutely nothing to change this metric because all of the things that make patients choose the emergency department are nothing that I have control of. And oh, by the way, all of those other measures that you measure me on, that you harass me about door-to-doc times and patient satisfaction, the fact that we are actually really good in this means that we are going to be patients' first choice of care. And that's a good thing. I mean, where else do you go? You don't go to McDonald's and have them say, why don't you go get a Burger King? They're excited when you come back. And only in emergency medicine do we actively discourage people from using our service. It's the weirdest service model in the world. And so I encourage my administrators to come in and say, this is a patient that I have who's had 130 emergency department visits in the last year. She also has almost that many or more primary care visits. It's not that she's not hooked in. You know, all of those things that you sit up here in your office and you tell us these are the ways that you fix that. Urgent care, fantastic, that's great. The closest urgent care to Madras is in Redmond. That's 35 miles away. They can barely make it to here, and asking them to go another 35 miles so that they can pay a copay to be seen in an urgent care where we won't ask for a copay, not gonna happen. Having those very specific stories to show, to put, yeah, our Medicaid rate is 12.8, I think, per 1,000. Fantastic. You want it below 6? Let me explain to you why 50% of my 7% of my patients drive 50% of my visits. And let's talk about the things that we can do that actually will impact these patients. And taking those numbers and actually putting someone with it and showing them that this is what the face of that number looks like, I found to be fairly effective. That's, again, my administrators are tired of that because I just say, look, I'm happy to work on this metric, but let's look at what's actually driving it and look at solutions that might matter because all of these things that you list out here, increased primary care usage, great. Some of my patients are there more than they're in my emergency room. Increasing health literacy, fantastic. Many of my patients didn't graduate from high school, and I can't necessarily fix that. Urgent care, fantastic, open one up. You're gonna take a loss on that too, by the way. Where exactly can I show you the person that's behind those numbers?
If I may add a question.
Uh-huh.
So, cultural anthropologist Professor Joseph Campbell talked about, after studying the hero myths from across the world in different cultures, outlined the archetype of the hero myth. When you're writing a story, how do you choose who's the hero? And sorry, that was a
No.
out of
it's-
nowhere question.
It was, you're gonna make me really think about that one. And I have to say that I don't actually think that I think about who's the hero, because my my immediate reaction to that is my patient is always the focus of that. And my response to that patient, I am certainly not the hero of that story. And I don't know that I would, because many of the patients that I write about, and like I said, I don't share a lot of mine, they're very much an anti-hero. I tell them about being angry at them for the choices that they make that put us in this situation, and now I can't fix you. I think that's a valid emotion to be able to share. It's not one that I share with patients. I don't tell them, why won't you just stay out of the cookies? Because that's not building a therapeutic relationship. But I think that it's okay to acknowledge that we get frustrated with patients. And again, my writing is a way to do that. Those are not ones that I share because that's not exactly the face that I want to share with the world. I have a piece that I wrote that actually I do talk a little bit about being angry with patients that come in the middle of the night or early in the morning, because I'm not a morning person. And I am less likely to be nice to you at 6 in the morning just because I can barely function as a human. But I don't know that I really think about who's the hero, just because I don't know that our stories lend themselves to heroes as well. I have to share that I'm a little bit torn today. One of my very best friends is over at Good Sam today, getting ready for her mastectomy. And I really hate all of these cancer warrior things, because warrior suggests that there's a win and a lose. And I struggle with that for her, because I want to tell her to fight, but it's really not a fight, because it's not a fair fight. None of us are in a fair fight here. We're all going to lose eventually. And so casting our patients as either heroes or victims, I worry about, because, again, to me, it's not a fair struggle. It's not a battle that we could ever win, and it's not that the person who died of their cancer didn't fight hard enough. And I worry about that message that sometimes people hear. Completely off the subject. My apologies.
Well, no, and I appreciate your response. I think my wonderment was really kind of deriving from this previous conversation, because it does, and maybe the stories don't lend themselves to that kind of archetype, but it does often invite some consideration around, well, who is the protagonist? Who is the villain? Is the disease the villain, or is the system the villain? So there's I just got my creative juices flowing, and I was just curious what your thoughts were.
Sometimes, definitely one of my pieces, the villain was night shifts, and what does that take out of your life? And how does that impact your world? Probably the villain, if you will, or the protagonist in my combat piece was a cousin who asked me, so what'd you see over there? Was it great? Yeah, it was super. I was in a war. What is the right answer to that? And so.
Well, I think we are at time. I want to thank you for those who stayed and who participated in this conversation. And thank you, Dr. McGowan,
Thank
again
you
for
all
your
so
thoughts.
much.